All right. So in this section, we will continue building the OmniFood project. And what that means is that now we will finally make it fully responsive. So such as any real-world project must be today. So we have been using already responsive design ingredients such as fluid grids and responsive units. But now it's time to make the website actually truly responsive by using media queries. And that's going to be really exciting one more time. And so let's go do this. Welcome back. So in this lecture, we're going to write our very first media query. However, before we can do that, let's learn a little bit how media queries actually work. And what I'm going to show you here is how media queries work with the max width property, which is what we use in desktop-first strategies. So that is exactly what we're doing in this case. But remember that there is also the mobile-first strategy. And so there we do use media queries with min width. But anyway, that's not really important now. And so let's talk about media queries with max width right here. So let's say that we wanted to apply a certain style for the range between 0 and 600 pixels. So then we could write a media query like this. So we would write @media and then max width 600 pixels. So basically, this media query checks if the current viewport width is smaller or equal than 600 pixels. And if it is, then all the CSS code that is in this media query will apply. And if not, well, then that code that is in the media query will not apply. So what this means is that the max width is 600 because 600 is the maximum width at which the media query still works, so where it still applies. Now after 600 pixels, for example at 700 pixels, it stops working. So the code is no longer going to be applied then. All right. Now let's try another one, because of course we can create more than just one media query. So for example, if we wanted to cover the space from 0 to 1200 pixels, we would write a media query like this. So now we have max width to 1200 pixels. And so this media query basically asks the question, is the width less or equal than 1200 pixels? And so if it is, then of course this code that is in this media query will be applied. All right, now inside these media queries here, we simply overwrite some specific parts of the global CSS, so the code that is outside of any media query. But all the rest of the global code will of course still apply. And so you can think of media queries as tools for basically overriding specific parts of our CSS at certain viewport width. Okay, but anyway, switching back to our two media query examples here, maybe you are wondering what happens if, for example, a certain phone has a width of 400 pixels. So which media query will apply now in this situation? And that is, of course, an excellent question. And the answer is indeed simple. So both queries will apply because both of the conditions are actually true, right? So these 400 pixels are less than 600 pixels, and they're also less than 1200 pixels. And so the code in both media queries will be applied. Now, if you have conflicting CSS declarations in these queries, which is in fact usually the case, then the one which appears last in the code is the one that will apply. But now another example, this time with a phone of 1000 pixels of width, or maybe actually a tablet. So here only the 1200 pixel media query applies because only that condition is true. So 1000 is of course less than 1200 pixels, but it is not less than 600. And therefore, only this 1200 pixel media query does apply here. So with that, I hope you understand now how the max width media queries work And so let's now switch to our code and try it out there. And just like in our previous projects, I will now create a copy of the code from the previous section for this section. So basically, I will build on the code, of course, from the previous section to now build the responsive OmniFood version. So let's call this one here responsive. But of course, you can simply keep working on the same code that you had in the previous section. So for you, there's no need to create a new folder here. I'm just doing that so that in the end, I can share the code with you nicely separated. So I can just drag that code here onto this icon, and then here we go. All right, so here is our index.html again. And then let's open this one to the other side, and the same for general. Okay. Also, let's go live here, just to open a new tab. And it is still the same here. Let's just reload, and there we go. So it's still the same port, so I can still use this one here because it is also on port 5500. So this port number here needs to be the same one as down here. All right. But anyway, let's now write our first media query here. And what I'm going to do here is to change some background color maybe. So here at this section hero. So add media and then max width. And let's try the ones that we just saw. So 1200 pixels. And for now, I'm back to using pixels here, but we will change that in a second. Or maybe just in the next lecture. But here, let's keep rolling now with pixels. Now inside of this media query, so in between these curly brackets here, we can simply write CSS rules just like we do outside of the query. So just like here. So we can simply now select that section hero again. So section hero, and then let's change the background color. Just like this. And let's make it orange-red like this. Give it a save, and let's actually try it out. So let me open up the DevTools here, because then we can see the width right here in the corner. So can you see the width there? It's 13, and now we're getting close to our media query. So let's see if it applies. So if everything works, now our hero should become red. And there we go. So indeed, that worked. Beautiful. Let's just make this here bigger again. For some reason, it's now really small. It's maybe a bit too much. But yeah, let's select this one here. And you see that indeed, now this code, so our media query is here, and it is now the code that is being applied. So this one is now overriding this other background color that we set by default outside of any media query, right? Of course, if we make it bigger again, then that will disappear. So now that CSS rule here is gone, but if we go back, then there it is. Okay, now let's try another one here. So now let's try the 600 pixel one. And again, I'm going to work on the section hero. And in this case, let's try to change the color here to white. Or maybe let's add a border. Why not? And a really big one, just so we can see this working. So a blue one. So making this like really, really ugly on purpose. Okay, so let's see. So we're still far away from 600, but as we approach it, Let's see, almost there, and there we go. There is our nice blue border all around this section here. So let's check out our inspector. Right here. And so you see that now both of them are indeed being applied. So just like in that example that we saw during the slide, right? But now let's try another thing, which is to add a conflicting CSS declaration. So let's say that we wanted the background color to be blue starting at 600 pixels, right? So let's see. And so indeed, now the blue is being applied and it is overriding the orange red here from before. So hopefully you can see that. So let's make it even bigger. So these DevTools, they become really, really important as we start building our responsive version here. So you see that the background color now has been defined 3 times. So first, it has been overwritten by this one here at 1200 pixels, but now 600 pixels, since it appears later in the code, is now the one that is being applied. So of course, before the 600, it will become orange, because now that other media query is not yet being applied. So in this situation, only the 1200 pixel query is being applied, but then of course at 600, both of them are being applied. And so then when there is conflicts like here, then the last one is being applied. And let me actually prove that to you, because if we move this one here back, so if we switch them basically, then, well, here you immediately see it, that it is now still the orange one who is being applied all the way from 1200 to, well, to 600 and less, right? So of course, the blue border is still being applied because there is no conflict there. But then here, with the background color, of course, there is a conflict. And so now it is this one who is being applied simply because it appears less in our code. Okay, and with this, hopefully you understood the fundamentals of media queries. Now, usually during development, we keep this window here big, and instead what we do, we click on this icon here, so to toggle this device toolbar. And so what this gives us is basically a way to simulate smaller viewports right here. So without having to manually resize the browser all the time. So here in this menu, we can select from different devices. And so then we get basically the dimensions of those devices. So the iPhone 6 Plus, for example, has a width of 414 and a height of 736. And yeah, here you have all these different devices, the iPhone X, for example. But the one that we are interested in here for now is simply this one here. So simply responsive, because then we can drag our size as we wish. So just like this. And here we then have also this scale factor. So we can like set this to 75, and then we can nicely see what's going on at different viewports. So let's see. And indeed, now our media query is being applied because we just passed our 600 threshold here. So see, it changes exactly at 600. So we can even manually set that here to 600. And then there we go. So at 600 it applies, but not at 601. All right. So this is the tooling for media queries, and you also already learned how they work. Now in the next lecture, we will figure out which breakpoints, so which width here we should actually use in our design, because there are of course many different ways in which we can select these. So 600 and 1200 are just some examples, but we could use any value here, of course. So this could just be like 857, or really whatever we wanted. So how do we know which values we should choose here and also how many media queries we should write? Well, let's learn that, as I just said, in the next lecture. In this lecture, you're going to learn about a couple of different techniques of selecting breakpoints. Now, first of all, what actually are breakpoints? Well, breakpoints are the viewport width at which we want our design to change. Or in other words, breakpoints are the pixel values that we want to put in our media queries. Now, about actually selecting these breakpoints, back in the day, we would simply use the screen width of popular Apple devices like the iPhone and iPad as breakpoints and simply call it a day. And while this is certainly the easiest way of doing it, we actually no longer do this. And that's for two important reasons. First, when we optimize for one very specific device, we ignore all the other users of the other devices. And so we create a worse experience for them, which doesn't make a lot of sense. And second, and even more important maybe, is that this strategy is an absolute nightmare for maintaining your code and keeping it up to date in the future. Because if tomorrow Apple releases a new phone with new dimensions, do you really want to go back and change all your media queries in all the projects that you have ever built? Well, I don't think so, right? And so that's why we call this the bad strategy, and therefore we need another one. So the next strategy is what I call the good strategy. And this one is based on screen width ranges. So basically what we do here is to look at the most used width for different categories of devices, like phones or tablets or desktop computers. And then we try to group them together in some logical way to then pick our breakpoints from that. And so this is already a lot better than the first strategy, because we're using a lot of different devices here. And even more importantly, we're not setting breakpoints at one specific device, but between similar device sizes. And so you can see that nicely by these red bars here. So we can assume that most phones are somewhere between 300 and 500 pixels, and that most tablets are between 600 and 900 pixels. And so therefore, we can place a breakpoint somewhere at 600 pixels. And the same works for other categories. So for example, most landscape tablets are between 900 and 1100 pixels, and desktops are usually above 1200 pixels. And so we can put a media query, for example, at 1200 pixels. So that is our breakpoint here. All right. So again, this is already a much better strategy than the first one, but we can make it even better by combining this with the perfect strategy. And the perfect strategy is basically all about setting breakpoints at places where the design breaks down. So in this strategy, we can try to completely ignore devices and device categories altogether and only look at our content and our design. And ideally, it works like this. So we begin at one screen size, either desktop or mobile size, and then we start decreasing our screen width or increasing it for mobile first. Then, as soon as the design breaks, so which means that the design no longer looks acceptable, we create a new breakpoint. And that's it. So, again, what we do in this perfect strategy is to just put the breakpoints wherever the design starts to look weird and like out of place, and try to not think about devices at all. Now, it's actually quite hard to do this one completely without thinking about devices. So without classifying breakpoints as a phone or as a tablet or something like that. So therefore, basically, we're going to use this perfect strategy together with the good strategy. So the one where we select breakpoints based on device width ranges as well. So let's start doing that in the next lecture. Let's now finally start making our OmniFoot website responsive. Now, before we actually write a single media query for our page, we first need to ensure that our HTML has one very important line, and that is this one here. So this meta tag here might seem quite unimportant, but actually for responsive web design, it is absolutely crucial. So if you wrote your HTML structure by hand, then you did not include, of course, this line of code here. And so you now need to pause the video and paste that there. Because again, without this meta tag here, so without this line of code, responsive web design will actually not work on physical mobile devices. So not on phones and not on tablets. And the reason for that is that browsers on mobile devices will basically zoom the page out by default until it fits the screen. And so that's not what we want with media queries. We simply want to make our entire layout, so our entire design, smaller, so less wide. And so therefore we need this line of code here, which will make it so that the page will actually match the screen's width. So that's what this one here does. So the width will be equal to the device width, and the scale initially should be 100%, so 1. And so what that means is that it will not zoom out of the page to fit it on the screen. Okay, but how this really works is not that important, but what matters is that you need to include this. So always include this line of code. Okay. So with that being said, let's now move on to media queries, and let's delete this small experiment that we did previously. And so now what I like to do is to create a new file for the media queries. So here in our CSS folder, we create yet another file. And this one I like to call queries.css. And then here in the HTML, of course, we need to include that file as well. So let's duplicate this last line and here change it to queries.css. And so now we have 3 CSS files, and well, that's no problem at all. So let's close this down, and I will actually now move these other CSS files here to the left panel, and then the queries on the right panel. And you will see in a minute why that is going to be really helpful. Okay, and so now we're ready to start writing our media queries, but for that we need our breakpoints. So basically the width at which we want to set the media queries. So let's use those 2 methodologies that we studied in the last lecture. So basically looking where our design breaks and also taking into account common screen width ranges. So let's check it out here. And here we don't need all the space because all we are interested in here now is changing this width. And we can even make it a lot smaller here so that we can see our page a bit better. So let's start here at 1500 pixels and starting to make our page smaller. Okay. Now remember that here we have a container width of 1200 pixels down here. So that's our common container, but here we actually have 1300, so it's a bit wider. And so already at this point here, we can see that the space here on this side between the OmniFoot and the left side is getting bigger than the space here. And of course, that's going to become worse and worse as we decrease the width. So here the design is not really breaking, but what we're going to do is to at some point also make this hero here 1200 pixels wide, just as the rest of the page. So just as the common container element. All right. Now there is an extremely common screen size at 1366 pixel. So somewhere around here, because these are the so-called HD ready screens. And so we can choose some value between 1300 maybe and this one. All right, so let's set our first breakpoint there, simply to make this hero just as wide as the rest of the page. So basically only that change, at least for now. Now there's one particularity about media queries that I didn't mention yet, which is the fact that we should also not use pixels in media queries. So just like we shouldn't use pixels for our layouts, we also shouldn't use them in media queries. And the reason for that is that using pixels will not adjust to the user's font size setting in the browser and also not to the user's zoom level. And so that is exactly the reason why throughout this whole project, we set the font size here to this percentage and not to a fixed size of 10 pixels like we had it previously here. Remember that? So that was the whole reason why here it is 62.5, because it is 10 pixels, which is what we want, divided by the default browser font size setting. And so just like here, we should now use rem instead of pixels. However, there is one very, very important particularity of these responsive units in media queries, which is the fact that they do not respond to this font size setting here in the HTML. Okay, so in other words, what that means is that in media queries, one rem is not 10 pixels. Instead, one rem will always be the default font size browser setting. So let me write that here actually. Rem and m, which is something similar, as I will tell you in a minute, do not depend on HTML font size in media queries. Instead, we assume that one rem is equal to one m is equal to 16 pixels. Now, you might be wondering, what is this m unit here instead of rem? Well, this one here, so rem is the root font size, while m is basically the current font size. But that's not really important here, because one rem is simply one m. But the reason why I'm even mentioning m here is because rem apparently has some bugs in some browsers when used in media queries. And therefore, we should not use rem in media queries, but m. Now, I'm not even sure if that's still the case, but let's do it like that anyway. So it's safer like that, and it works in the exact same way as rem. So media, and then max width. And here, remember, now we need to set a value in m, and we didn't really choose the value yet, not even in pixels. But remember from our previous discussion here that we were looking for some value between this one here and maybe 1300. So let's try maybe 1350. Okay. So to convert that to m, we simply divide that by 16 pixels. So I'm using this built-in calculator here, but you can use any other. So 1350 divided by 16. So that's this strange value here, but I prefer to use like round values. And so let's go with 84. So 84 m. And that's it. Now here, let's add some comment. I will just get this code from here. And so this is below. And let's calculate the pixels now again. And so that's then, of course, the other way around. So 84 times 16. So this media query will, under normal circumstances, fire at 1344 pixels. So 1344 pixels. And so that's basically for smaller desktops, so smaller computers, basically. Okay. So finally, we have our first media query here, and we also have our first breakpoint. And so now let's finally also write our very first CSS rule in this media query. And so we're going to do what I said before, which is to change the max width here to also 1200, just like we have it in the general container. So just like this one here, right? So let's write that here. So max width 120 rem. And of course, this rem here has nothing to do with this m here. It still works exactly the same way as before, before we even started with responsive web design. Okay, so give it a save. And let's wait. And there it is. You saw that? There we changed our width, and now it is completely aligned here with the rest of the content. So it has now the exact same width. Now with that, we created a new problem, which is that now this heading here switched to 4 lines, basically. And this doesn't look so good. And so let's also put down this value here a little bit. So decrease it basically 1 step. So that's easy as well. So that's called the heading primary. And let's actually get our most important styling values here. And this time I'm putting them here in the bottom, because with that we will be able to easier see them. So let's see what the H1 is right now. So it's at 5.2. So 52 pixels here. And so let's try to step it down to the value below. So 4.4 rem. So font size 4.4 rem. And that does indeed fix it. So let's see again. And beautiful. So now if the user has like a smaller screen, let's say some laptop that has maybe this size, then everything looks nice. Well, at least here, because if we scroll down a little bit, then you see that here we actually start having some problems as well. And even more so when we start making it even smaller. So that problem actually starts quite early, so somewhere around this point, but let's not add too many media queries. So it's not a good practice to add like 10 or 15 or even 20 media queries to fix every single problem. So that's not so good. And so instead what we will do here is to simply use our media query, so the breakpoint that we already have, which is somewhere around here. And what we will do at that point is to switch this layout here from the 3 columns to just 2. And with that, we should very easily fix this problem. All right. So that's in our style. And so now you can see why it is so helpful to have this one here open on the left and this on the right. Because then you can very easily see the style on one and create a similar one on the other side. So that's right here. And here is the gallery with its 3 columns. So I'm just copying all of this. Makes it a bit easier. And just delete what I do not need. Switch it to 2, and that's it. Let's go back. And there we go. So now it appears that there is way too much space here, but well, we cannot make it perfect for every single screen size. Okay? So one of the more common ones might be 1200 pixels exactly. And so there it does look quite okay, I think. I mean, it's not perfect here, but we don't need to worry about that because we will probably also add a media query next somewhere around this width, because here some more problems start to appear. So now I just wanted to fix these first issues that appear at the very beginning, because remember how I mentioned in the last lecture or in the one before it, that what we do basically when we build a responsive design like this is to start at the top, so at the biggest width, and then make it smaller and smaller and keep adjusting whenever our design breaks. At least that's the way we do it when we're building desktop first, which is the case here. Now, if we were building mobile first, then everything would be the opposite way. So then the code outside of the media queries, So basically all the code that's here and here would be for the smaller screens. And then we would keep increasing the browser window and would add media queries here using min width. All right, but I'm not going to go deep into that now because, well, that's not the way we are doing it here right now. And so I think for now, there's no need to learn that very deeply. So actually, that's it for this breakpoint here. And so let's wrap up the video here and create our next breakpoint in the next one. In this video, we're going to start targeting mobile devices. And in particular, in this one, we will make our website respond to landscape tablets. And so let's continue decreasing our viewport width here so that we can find our next breakpoint. So let's keep going down. Right. And maybe let's stop here for now. So let's see if some things are broken here. And for now, it still looks quite nice. But here, if we take a look, then the text here is now looking quite bad, actually. So it's a really thin column with a lot of lines. Also here, we start getting text in multiple lines, and the same here. So in some of these columns, we have now 4 lines in here as well. And also here, this one here. So this entire section is now a bit too high because also this text here moved into 3 lines. And the same thing actually here. Now, since we're so zoomed out, it actually still looks quite okay. But if we make it like 100%, and like imagining that this is a tablet, then maybe we can start to see that everything looks like really huge here, right? So the design that we built has a lot of spacing, and it also has some really big text in some situations. And so we now should start making this a bit smaller. Actually, let's move up a little bit more here, because well, this one here is one of the breakpoints that I use, I would say always, so 1200 pixels, because that is where we start getting into mobile device territory. Now, as we just learned previously, we shouldn't just base our breakpoints on the device width, but also on where the design breaks. And in this case, it's not yet really visible that the design is breaking, at least not in terms of the layout. But still, everything is quite too big here. So everything looks like huge. So even at 1200, and so yeah, let's fix that right now. So we will add a breakpoint at 1200 pixels, which is something that I usually always do. So add media max width. And now remember how we make the calculation from pixel to m. So that's 1200 divided by 16. So that's a nice round number of 75 m. Let me grab this. And so this is below 1200 pixels. Let's say tablets here. Or actually landscape tablets. So tablets in the orientation of landscape, because with just tablets, we usually mean them in portrait mode. Okay. And so let's start fixing that overall feeling that we have that everything is too big. So how do you think we could do that? Well, we can now finally use to our advantage the fact that we used responsive units from the very start. Now, in fact, everything that we're doing here only works because we already have the other 3 responsive web design ingredients already in place. So we already have a fluid grid and responsive images and responsive units, right? Otherwise, none of this would work at all. So all the fluidity that we can see here, like that the design even changes a little bit when we do this, when we change the viewport width, all of that is only because we already have flexible images and a fluid diet in the first place, right? And so now let's make use of that other ingredient that is responsive units. Now, what do I mean with responsive units? Well, I simply mean the fact that we have been using rem all the time here, right? And what that means is that all of these lengths, so all of the sizes basically that we defined anywhere on the page, are dependent on this one setting right here. So on this font size, right? So if we now change this, every single length and every single font size on the page will immediately change, right? So if we want to make everything smaller, basically, we can simply change that font size. And so that is the big trick of using this technique. So of sizing everything using rem. So font size, and now for demonstration, let me just actually set it just to pixels here and to something really small. So 5 pixels is of course way too small, but I just want you to demonstrate the dramatic effect that we can achieve with this simple change here. So let's make this big again, and let's zoom out here. And so watch what happens once we approach. Yeah, you saw that? Everything became really small, right? And again, all of that is simply because of the power of sizing everything in rem and then changing that one setting. So basically changing the definition of what one rem is right there in the media query. So just with this, everything became small again, right? Except here for these images, because they are indeed sized in percentages, right? Now, of course, we don't want to make this dramatic of a change here. So here, actually, I want to set it to 9 pixel. So just moving it down 1 pixel, basically. But of course, I also don't want to set it in pixel, but in percentages. So 9 pixel divided by 16 pixels. So again, using the calculator here, 9 divided by 16 is 56.25%. Okay, so 56.25%. And so now the change will not be as dramatic, but there will be some change. So let's see. And there it is. So all of a sudden, everything became just a small tad smaller, right? And so this can make a difference indeed. So even, of course, the layout itself, as we come here, is now smaller, right? So it was already touching the sides here, but now not anymore. Because now our container, which used to have 1200 pixels, now only has, let's see, so 120 rem. So it used to be 1200, but now it is only 1080 pixels. So that's actually a big difference, right? So that's very cool. This is really an amazing trick that we can use when we build these kinds of websites. So back in the day when I built my first responsive website and I didn't know about this, well, I would simply have to go and change manually all the single pixel length and all the font sizes that I had defined in pixels. And that would be so much work. And with this, it is really a lot easier. Now, of course, that doesn't cure all the problems. So some text is probably still a bit too big. So we can fix that. For example, this text right here still looks quite big. So the secondary heading and the same also for the tertiary heading. And probably it's also time to decrease the spacing in our grid. So here the spacing between these columns is starting to get really big. And maybe here also we have a little bit too much space. All right. But by far the biggest and most important change that we did here was this one. But anyway, let's now decrease the secondary and tertiary headings. The primary, I think, is not necessary yet because we just did that here. And so at this point, actually, the primary heading has the same size as the secondary heading. So that doesn't make a lot of sense. And so in this media query, let's now move both of them here one step down. So from 44 to 36, this one, 3.6 rem. So, and I'm still doing the calculation here as if 1 rem was still 10 pixels, okay? So just for consistency with the initial code, I will always still assume that 1 rem is 10 pixels here, all right? So we do not change that mental convention that we have. Okay. The tertiary and font size 2.4 rem. So that is here the next step after 3 rem. Next up, as I was saying, let's also change the grid a little bit. So let's change the column gap. Let's go one step down. So 4.8 is after 6.4. And then the row gap. And this one was very big to begin with. And so let's take this one down even 2 steps. So to 6.4 rem. All right. So let's check it out. So that still looks quite the same. But yeah, if you see here now, this H2 now changes a lot, actually. And also the spacing here now looks a bit better. And especially if we make this even smaller. So of course, we cannot just test at 1200, right? We also need to test, for example, here, maybe at 1000 pixels. So 1050 right now, because of course, we will not add a lot of media queries. Maybe the next one is going to be like at 900 or 950, but so in that range, it needs to look great, right? So here, it's actually still not so great, but I will leave it like this for now, actually. So this section here is a bit hard to fix, and I will maybe fix that a bit later once we go into the next media query. All right. But yeah, so I think everything looks a lot better now, even at this width. So we just did the 1200 media query, but even here, it now looks quite decent, right? So this is good already. Let's just go up a little bit, because here now the spacing on this side is different than it is here. So you see that this one here is now more on the inside, and the same here on this button. And so that does not look good at all. So we now want this logo here and this button to be aligned to the side. So having basically this same padding that we have here. So let's see where that is. So that's in the navigation, or actually in the header. Yeah, right here. So we have a padding of 4.8 rem on the sides, while on the usual container, we have 3.2. And so that's what we also want in the header. So let's actually copy this line of code here and put that in the header. Okay, great. So now that is consistent. And I was just thinking that here we actually also have this big gap that we had in the grid. So that's the exact same gap. So let's also decrease that. So here in the hero, you see, well, it's actually here. So that the gap is 9.6. So let's also take that down to just 4.8. So here, the hero 4.8 rem. All right. Yeah, so that looks better because now there's more space for this image here to grow a little bit. So that looks nicer. All right. Then of course it starts breaking here again at some point, but that we will fix later. There's just something that I also noticed while preparing this lecture here, which is that on a big size, we actually have way too less space between these menu items. So that's something that we should have done better in the last section. So let's fix that now, actually. So that's here in the menu as well. So yeah, not in the header, but indeed here in the main nav list. So here we want 4.8 at the normal state. So one step up from 3.2. And so that does indeed look a lot better. But now as we come to this smaller width, it is time to then decrease that. All right. So basically we want it to be 3.2 rem. So one step down at this point here. So gap 3.2 rem. Okay. So let's, yeah, so see how the spacing decreases there. So that looks better now on this, let's say, smaller screen. So at this point, we might be ready to actually test this on like a virtual tablet here, like this iPad. And it should be in the landscape view. So that has 1024 pixels. And so that should look good in the media query that we just did. And indeed, I think that it does. So this looks probably a bit similar to what we have when we scale it up. So in the view for the big screen that we developed over the last section. Now here again, it's not perfect, and we might fix that a bit later. All right. So yeah, I don't find any flaws here. We could maybe decrease all the spacing also in the beginning and the end of the sections, so that padding, but yeah, let's not do that. That's starting to become too much work. And yeah, we can also do that maybe in some next media query. Now, maybe just to make this really a lot better, let's maybe actually fix this one here simply by removing some of the padding here on the sides. So this entire element here is called the testimonials container. So I know that was way back. So while you're following these videos here on making the page responsive, you might need to stop the video from time to time in order to go back and analyze the code that we are changing. All right. So I cannot always go back to the HTML and find exactly what is the element that we need to change. So I already know that beforehand. And so I can just tell you here so that we do not waste too much time. Okay. So this testimonials container here is again what has that huge padding. So let's fix that here. And it can stay for now 9.6 rem at the top and bottom, just to stay consistent. But then at the sides, I also wanted to have the same 3.2, just like the header and the container. Okay. And so that now looks quite better again, because now the text looks a bit more like a square here, right? And also now the alignment is exactly as the rest of the page. Okay, now here, of course, there is this too big spacing, but that's not a problem. All right, so I think we are done here for this media query, but of course, we will need a next one soon. So maybe here, for example, we start getting some more problems, and yeah, so let's do that in the next lecture. Let's keep working on our responsive layout. This time adding another breakpoint and another media query which is going to respond to tablets. So, in the last lecture we introduced a breakpoint at 1200 pixels, so around here, and so we fixed our design basically at that screen width. So here now everything looks good, and let's actually zoom out a little bit so we can see like everything at once. So again, here everything looks good, but of course a media query should not work at just one specific point. So instead, as a rule of thumb, I would say that a media query should work over a range of at least 200 or 300 pixels. All right. So as I had already mentioned, we should not like add a media query every 50 pixels to fix every single design problem that appears as we scale down the page. And so let's now go down maybe 300 pixels to 900 and analyze what our design looks like and if we need to fix something here. So first of all, this heading here now went into 4 lines. So this doesn't look really good. And overall, there is not really a lot of space here anymore in this hero section to have this content here on one side and the image on another side. Also down here we see that these logos are way too big at this point and they're really cramped together. So there's not really enough space here for separation. Then, here also this title now moved into 2 lines, and so that makes it so that this card on the left side is bigger than this one. So that's not ideal as well. Then here again we have that problem that there's not enough width basically to fit this content here on the left side. And so we should fix that as well. And yeah, here also this image is looking now a bit too narrow, and probably we could also make this here now wider. So these input fields, they also look a little bit too small to me at this point. So it's time now to make some of the things here basically move into just one column. For example, here we could switch from these 2 columns to just one, and I would say we should do the same thing also here in the hero. And so let's now find the exact breakpoint where we are going to do all that. So let's see here. So here, at least this part still looks okay. And so I think I will go with a width where this here breaks into another line. So something like 940 pixels. So let's go back and add that new media query right here. So add media max width. And now let's again do that calculation. So 940 divided by 16. And let's round this one to 59M. And so that would be 59 times 16. So 944 pixels, which is perfect. So 59M. And let's again add some comment here, just so we also know what these values here actually mean, because 59M is not really that intuitive. So 944 pixels, and let's say that this one here is more for tablets. So we're still kind of thinking about devices here, but also using, of course, our design to really see where the design breaks and not simply use blindly something like 900 pixels. So instead, our design breaks something around here, and so that's where we put our breakpoint. But anyway, let's now scale down the value of 1 rem even more to basically make the entire design a bit smaller here once again. So that's exactly, remember, what we did here previously, right? So now here at this width, 1 rem is 9 pixel, and so now let's move that to even smaller at 8 pixels. All right. So here we will want the font size to be 50%. And that's of course because 8 pixels, which is our target, divided by 16 pixels is 0.5, which is 50%. All right. So that immediately will have some impact right there. And I think I need to reload the page here. Yeah. So that immediately fixes some of the things here. But again, the media query cannot just work at this width, but it needs to work like maybe at least until here. And so here, of course, this doesn't look acceptable anymore, right? And so now at this breakpoint that we are working at currently, we need to do some of the changes that I just talked about at the very beginning. So first of all, let's turn this hero section here into just one column, and then it will essentially become one of these other types of hero sections that we saw before in our layout lecture, where the content here is on top and centered, and then below that there is some image. And so that will then be this image right here. So let's do that. And so let's of course start by checking our current code so that we can then change that. So here we have our hero section, and we have those two columns because of this line of code right here, right? And so now changing that to just one column is very, very easy. So I'm just copying this now. Okay, so that is the original, and changing that to just one column is as simple as doing this, right? So let's check that out, and it is already working. Now this image here is huge and way too huge, but you saw that it was very easy indeed to simply change the layout here to a one column layout, right? And that's once again because of the power of CSS Grid. It makes it really, really easy to design responsive layouts because of that. Now anyway, let's start by fixing the image here, which again is way too big. So that's the hero image, which currently has 100% of width. So let's take that down to something like 60%. And that is a lot better. So it still looks quite big here, but remember that we also need to account for smaller width. For example, something like this. And so I think that for now it looks good this way. But of course, now we need to center everything here. So let's see what we have here. So we have, let's see the HTML. That's actually a bit simpler. So here is our hero section. And remember that the two columns are this hero text box and this hero image box right here. And so we can basically set text align to center in both of them. And that should then, center all the text content and even the image content in there. Because an image is an inline element, and so it is also affected by text align center. So let's try that. So hero text box, and the same with hero image box. All right, let's see. And that already looks a bit better. And now we just need to make the same thing happening here. And also what I'm seeing here is that this content is way too wide. So like this, it doesn't look good at all, right? So with this huge line here, and then just one word down here. So we need to add a lot more padding here to make this look a lot more natural. So we're going to do that and also try to center this content right here. So that content right there is this delivered meals. All right. So let's check that. And this one here is actually a flex container. So here things are going to work a bit different. So not with text align center, but we can still do it. So delivered meals. And now how do we center content using Flexbox? Well, that's just justify content set to center, right? And now here about that spacing in the hero. So let's see what the padding is currently. So we have this here, 3.2, just like in the container, remember? But let's increase that to a lot, something like 80 pixels. And let's see. Okay, beautiful. That's looking really nice. Now here there's just a bit too much space. So let's actually reduce that. And let's figure out what the spacing is here actually. So that should be exactly the gap here. So right now in the hero, we have a gap of 4.8, but I think we should use a little bit more space here. So let's actually increase that. So we decreased this gap in the previous media query, but that was because it was a horizontal gap. But now vertically, we need a little bit more here clearly. And so let's basically put it back up. So let's fix that spacing here and here, basically moving this one more up because of our visual hierarchy. So this content belongs more to this one here than to the image. Okay. So our delivered meals right now is has a margin top of 8 rem. So that's really a lot. So let's move that to 3.2 rem. And then about that gap here, let's maybe change that to 6.4. So moving it back up one step from 4.8. Okay, beautiful. That looks extremely nice, I think. And even down to these smaller widths like this, right? So I like this part. So let's move on in our page, kind of like at this width here. And the next thing I said we were going to fix is these logos here. So they are a bit too big and the spacing between them is getting too small. And so let's simply make them a little bit smaller. So that shouldn't be too hard. So we just need this selector right here. And so one step down from 3.2 rem is 24 pixels. So just like this. Okay, so that's looking better. And we can also tone down the size of this text here a little bit. So that's maybe also looking a bit too huge now. So that's the step number. So here it is. And indeed, the font size is very big. And so the next step below that is 7.4 rem. All right, then let's keep going here. And here everything looks good still at this point. But remember that the media query needs to work across like at least 200 pixels, right? So we set our breakpoint at 950 or 40. And so here, at least it should still look okay. So at 800, right? But again, here we now have that problem of this text moving into another line. Let's make it a bit bigger just to see it better. And indeed, we can see that our spacing inside this card might be a little bit too big, right? So this hasn't really yet adapted to our new layout, so to our kind of more a narrow and less spacey layout. And so let's fix that right now. So just moving down here in our original code, that padding is coming from here, right? So again, just grabbing that and then moving each of these here one step down. So from 32 to 2.4 and the other ones to 3.2. 2 and just one more. Okay. Beautiful. So that fixed it, and the spacing here now looks a bit more in line with the rest of the content. Okay, moving down a little bit further here. So here it's now also time to basically turn all this into just one column. So basically one column for this content here, and then another column below that for this gallery. So once again, that should be quite easy to do. So let's move down here. And so here is where that layout is defined, right? So in these grid template columns. Now we could also try to play around with these two values here, maybe trying to make the gallery even more narrow, but I think it's time to actually just move it to a one column layout. So section testimonials. And here we have a small typo. So grid template columns, and again, just setting everything to 1 FR, which of course could be any other value, but like this, it will simply be transformed into one column. So that works, but now this will look terrible, right? Because these images are way too big. So we have a huge gallery here because it only has 2 columns. But that is once again very, very easy to fix. So right now, let's actually try a layout where the gallery is wider than it is high. So maybe even instead of having a 2 by 6, we can have a 6 by 2. So 6 columns with just 2 rows. So that's here at gallery. But I think we actually already did that at some point. Yeah, right here. So here we changed it to just having 2 columns. And so now let's change it to 6. So let's see. Oh, beautiful. So that looks amazing. So really, really cool. We could have gone for maybe a 4 by 3. Let's try that also. All right, but now it actually takes up too much content, and even more so at our original breakpoint right here. So I think that the gallery like this is a little bit too big, and so let's really go with 6 columns. But you see how easy it is to simply change the entire layout of all this here by simply changing one single value in the CSS. So that's really just amazing what we can do with CSS Grid. So let's keep analyzing here at this width. So just inspecting once again, everything is perfect here, I would say, except for the navigation maybe, but that we will think about a bit later. And so moving down here, this one here also still looks okay, I think, even though this one moved into 2 lines. But the alternative would be to make these ones here now like 100% of the width, and then I think they would become a bit too large, so a bit too wide. Now what we can do is to add some line height here to these list items. And that we will do not just, of course, in the media query, but simply in general. So no matter what screen width in this list, there should be some line height. So I think it should be, well, apparently it's more here at the end. So here, let's try a line height and more of a smaller one like 1.2. And that looks already a little bit more friendly. So 1.2, I'm not sure if we had used that already. Oh yeah, so medium 1.2, and so that's the one that we're going for now. And also let's add the one that we have been using a lot. So let's call it large 1.8 since we're here. Okay, so that is now also fixed. Now here, there's not a lot that we can change because we already changed the gap of the columns here. So I'm leaving it like this for now, but then here again, it's time to at least make this form here into just one column and maybe give some more size to this image here. So now it is very narrow and it looks a bit unnatural like this. So let's start by fixing that. So yeah, so that's right here in the CTA section. And the width of that image is basically defined here by this grid, right? So we have now basically 2/3 for the content and 1/3 for the image, right? Let me just write that down here. So we have 2 and 3 because 2 plus 1 is 3. So the total is basically 3 parts. And so 2 of that, which is 66.6%, and then the other one is 1 and 3, which is 33.3%. All right. But now if we wanted to change that more to like a 60-40 ratio, we could simply do this. So dot CTA. And so if we change this here to 3 and to 2, then we would have a total of 5. And so then we would have 3 and 5, which is 60%. And of course, 2 and 5 is 40%. So this will look a little bit better, hopefully. And yeah, so that's nice. But now again, here, this is way too narrow. And so let's make this into just one column. So that should be defined by some other grid property. Yeah, right here. So this CTA form right here and grid template columns, just one FR. Giving that a save, and that looks quite good, right? Now the entire thing here just became a bit bigger, but that's not a problem at all. Here the spacing just looks slightly off. So let's see if we can add some margin there. Let's see what we have actually here. And I think that button is indeed here. So this file is getting a little bit big to easily find our things, but well, we could split it up even further, but that would then at some point also be unmanageable having all these files. Anyway, here is our button for the form. Let's just add some margin there. So margin to the top of maybe 1.2 rem. And yeah, that looks better here because now the spacing seems to be the same, at least somehow, between these form elements and the button. All right. So I think that this looks nice. So even here at this breakpoint, let's go even a bit more down. So 750 approximately, and still everything looks acceptable at least. So probably around here is where we will have our next breakpoint. But yeah, so here it's again in 2 lines. And so yeah, we're going to fix that soon. But for now, it is time to think about the navigation here. So at this point here, I think it is time to actually start our mobile navigation. So having a navigation where all of this here is basically hidden in some panel that opens up once you click on the menu button. So I'm sure that is something you have seen all the time, and this is what we will do in the next lecture. Let's now transform our simple navigation bar into a mobile navigation. And this is going to be no easy task, and it's going to require a lot of code. And so let's get started right away. So basically what we want to happen is that once we reach our breakpoint here, so this one right here, we want all of this menu here to disappear, and instead we want a menu button to show up right here. So just as I said before, this is something that I'm sure you have seen on other web pages and also on mobile applications, right? And so let's actually start with that. So adding that menu button right here. So let's go to our HTML. So this button, of course, needs to be in our HTML from the very beginning. So that's here in the header. And let's put that after this navigation. So we have this logo, then the navigation, and then a button, which I'm going to call button for the mobile nav. So mobile navigation. And now here inside, we simply want an icon with the menu. So let's come here again to our iron icons. And so this here is kind of the standard icon for menus. So copying that. All right. Let's add a class of icon mobile navigation. And actually, we will also want an icon for closing the navigation. So let's quickly get that. So close. Okay. Let's duplicate this. And actually, I remember it was just close here. So we're adding these two icons here because basically what we will do is that the default icon is going to be this one with the menu. And then when the user hits this button, then the mobile navigation will show. And then we will hide this first icon and display the close icon. All right. So when the navigation is hidden, we show the menu icon. And then when it's visible, we show the close icon to give the user the option to close it. Okay, let's copy this here because of course we will need to style it. And the other one is icon mobile nav. So that's at the very top of the file here. So yeah, right here. Let's just add a small comment here. So this one and icon. And let's see what it looks like by default. So we have this button here. Let's make it at 100%. And of course, thanks to Flexbox, it is also vertically aligned. And since we have justify content set to space between, now this part here is centered between these two, right? But of course, we will then make this part here invisible and only show our button. But anyway, let's now format this button here. That's right here. So we need to get rid of the border and also of the background color. So we usually set simply background to none. And we also wanted to have this pointer cursor. Okay. And then quickly also the icon here. So let's see what we have here. So let's make it 4.8 rem of height. and also of width. And the color, let's use our darkest gray. Now, okay, so that looks nice, but of course, by default, we want one of them here to be hidden. All right, so we want to now select this one here, so the closing one, and then hide that. So how are we going to do that? So here in our HTML, we could now, of course, add another class here and call this one here like the menu button and this one the close button. However, here I want to show you another selector. So let me, so just because now we don't have it here side by side, I'm copying all this, but you don't have to. And I'm going to paste that here into a comment just so we can see the code. Okay, and so I will now use this selector here again. And then what I want to do is to select this element based on this name attribute that is here. So that's what's distinguishing these two icons here. So this one has menu outline and this one has a close outline, right? And so we can actually select in CSS based on attributes. So for example, like this name one here. So the way we do that is with these square brackets, and then we simply write this. So we can simply write name equal menu outline, right? And actually the one that we want to hide here now is the closed one. So the second one. So we don't need this anymore. So display none. So now this is turned off. So that close icon is gone. But then later, once the user clicks on this button, we will switch from the menu icon to the close icon. All right. Now, of course, by default, this should here be completely hidden, right? This should not exist. And so by default, of course, we need to turn this off. So make it hidden, right? So this entire button right now. So display none once again. And so then, of course, it is gone. Okay, so by default, for normal width, we want it to be gone. But then, of course, once we reach this media query here that we have been working on, we now want to show that button. So mobile navigation. So display, and let's display it as a block level element. So let's wait for it. And there it is. Great. So that part was easy, but now comes the harder part of actually styling and creating a mobile navigation. So this mobile navigation will need to work for this width and for all the other width that will come later. So for example, even on a small phone, so something like this, which right now doesn't really work because of this white space here. So let's just go with this one here. So what I want to do now is to basically overlay the navigation over this entire screen here. So creating like an overlay and then having these menu items here one after another displayed here vertically. So first how it works, then below the meals, testimonials, pricing, and then that call to action button. And again, having all of that on top, basically on the page. All right. So the way we are going to do that is to basically remove this element from here using CSS with absolute positioning. So let me show you how we could do that. First of all, we need to, of course, take a look what elements we're actually talking about. So it's this main nav here, right? So this is the one that we basically want to now position absolutely and make it so that it basically occupies the entire screen. So main nav, let's copy that. let's first give it a background color so we see what we're doing here. Let's say blue. And now we want to position it absolutely. Let's put it at the top and a left of 0 for now. And now, as always, when we position an element absolutely, we first need to make the parent element position relative, right? However, that might not really be necessary because actually we don't want to position this in relation to the header, but really to the entire viewport. And so we can simply leave it as it is for now and just test it out. Okay, and so this element has already been taken out of the flow here. So it's basically no longer a flex item like it used to be, and instead it is indeed here in the corner. Let's actually give it a white background so we can see it a bit better. And so now let's make it occupy the entire screen. So first of all, width 100%, and then the height. Remember how we can make it stretch all the way from top to bottom? Well, we can give it a height of exactly 100% of the viewport. So 100 viewport height units. Remember that? So let's see what that's going to look like. And indeed, that's already looking quite nice. Okay, and now let's make the text bigger here. Center everything here inside of this container. So putting it here in the middle, and also stack these navigation items. So having one after the other, as I mentioned in the beginning. Now, in case you're wondering why we are doing the design like this and covering up here almost all of the hero section, this is of course just temporary what we're doing here. So by default, this navigation here will of course be hidden, and it will only be shown once the user clicks this button. Okay, so again, this is just going to be the open state, but by default, of course, we will be able to see the hero section that is underneath. Okay, and to demonstrate that, let's actually change the color here to something transparent. So clicking here, let's do something really small or really big. So actually a very little transparency here, but it's going to be enough to see the effect. And so now let's, as I was saying, center everything. And for that, we're going to use display set to flex, because I think that right now this navigation is not a flex container. But let's check that out. Main nav. Oh, and actually we hadn't yet done anything on it. And so it was not a flex container yet. So align items, center, and justify content, center. So as always, centering both horizontally and vertically using this flexbox trick. Okay, but now this main nav list, which is the actual UL element. So this one here, now this is already a flex element because we used it to put these list items here side by side. Right, so right here. But now what we want to do is to change the flex direction. But now what we want to do is to simply change the flex direction there. So to have them stacked on top of each other. So flex direction and set it to column. And let's maybe increase the gap back. So we reduced it, I think, here before to, well, maybe we didn't. But I do think that we did. Yeah, so here we changed it to 3.2. Let's put it back to 4.8 now. 4.8 rem. Let's give it a save, and nice. So that's looking a lot better than before already. And of course it is nicely centered. And well, now we still have some elements here which are giving us too much space. So that's this here. So that's why we cannot go this low, but it will work also later once we can do that. All right, now let's just increase this text here a lot. And that should then be enough. So that's this code right here. So font size 3 rem. Okay, beautiful. Now this might appear to be way too big here, but if you actually see this on a mobile device, like a phone, then it will look just right. All right, so this was the easiest part. So hopefully you were able to follow up until this point, because now we actually need to hide this here, so all of this container, in a correct way, and also come up with basically a mechanism that we can use later in JavaScript to create the effect of showing and displaying this navigation. So we will not be able to do that functionality. So when we click here, that the navigation actually show with CSS alone. But what we can do is to already prepare everything and basically do that manually. So let me show you what I mean with that. So first of all, we need a way of hiding this navigation. So because by default, of course, it should be hidden, right? So hide the navigation. Now we have used this before. So doing display none, right? And so if you take a look, then of course it is gone. Now the problem with display none is that when we use this on an element, we can do no animations. So transitions will not work when we have display set to none. So that's really, really annoying. And so we will need to find a way around this. So let me write that here. Allows no transitions at all. No, we move down here. So I wanted to actually comment it just like this. And so the first thing that we will do here is to set the opacity to 0. So this I think we have also done before in order to hide an element, but this does not exactly hide it. So this is not enough to just set opacity to 0, but more about that in a bit later. Because let's now actually animate this value here, because this is a value that we can indeed animate, while display none we cannot animate. So as I just said before, right? So if we check out, then the element is still gone, right? And that's because it has the opacity of 0. If it had like 20%, then it would be a little bit visible, right? So it's barely visible now here on top, but again, let's set it to 0. Okay, but anyway, now it's time to actually start thinking about the mechanism that we're going to use to show and hide the navigation. And so what we're going to do now is exactly what we did in the component section. So in section number 6, where we built that accordion. So back then, remember, we added a class to the element that we wanted to be open. And so then based on that class, we applied different styles. So we styled the element to then be open and show a small box beneath the main part. So remember that? And if not, then that's not a big problem. So let me just show it to you here in our code. So here we're going to do the same thing, and we will add a class to the header whenever the navigation is open. So let's call that class navOpen here. And so this is the class that will be added and removed using JavaScript. And so whenever the navigation is open, navOpen will be present here on this header element. All right. So that's a very, very common technique when we build components like this, which need to change their state a little bit based on JavaScript later. So we're going to be able to write some very, very simple JavaScript, which will simply add and remove this class here, depending on whether the user has clicked the navigation button or not. But anyway, let's now pretend that the navigation is currently open. And so then we can apply styles based on that. So see how this nav open here is now a parent of main nav, right? And so we can use that in our CSS like this. So nav open and then main nav. Then the opacity should be back to 1. All right. And so if we check this out now, then here it goes. So now it's back. So let's see that in the inspector here. So indeed, here is the nav open class. And so therefore, we now have this code that we just written. So basically, when the nav open exists, then this main nav style here can be applied. But of course, if we were to remove this class from here, then the selector here would no longer apply. And we can actually simulate that here by simply deleting it, hitting enter, and then that style is gone. Right? Simply because that selector now does no longer apply. So this one here, it cannot apply if this class is not on the page, right? And so that is the whole idea behind this trick. Okay. Now let's add an animation here. Let's do that before. So transition all and 0.5 seconds. Okay. And to show you that, we actually need to reload to make that class back. And now if I remove it here, then actually the animation should already be showing. So you saw that? It faded out here a little bit over that half second. So that part, we already have it working. All right. But now remember how I said that this is actually not enough to hide the navigation. So to hide the navigation properly without using display none, we need to do a couple of steps. So this one is the first one, which is to hide it. So hide the element visually. Then second, we need to make it inaccessible to mouse and the keyboard. Because otherwise, if we do not this, then if we hit the tab key, for example, it will still go to the links that are in that hidden element. So because that element is really still on the page. So display none does really remove the element from the page's flow. It is as if the element does not exist. But with opacity set to 0, all that happens is that it becomes invisible. All right. But things like keyboard tabs, they can still then end up there. So even if it's visually hidden. And so in order to prevent that, we need to set pointer events to none. All right. And then finally, the third step is to also hide it from screen readers. So basically telling screen readers that this element is really hidden. So we do that by setting visibility to hidden. And so this is the correct way of hiding an element without using display none. Okay, but then of course, when we want to open the navigation, we need to set all of that back to normal. So pointer events to auto and visibility to visible. Now these CSS properties here, they probably look a bit strange, like a bit obscure, like this one here especially, because this is one of those that you will very rarely use, right? So if you need to build something like this, you just come here and basically copy this line of code, and that's it. This is one of those properties you will probably never memorize, right? Okay, so let's put it back here. And again, we could now remove this here to test it, but that's not really necessary. Because what I want to do now is to actually change this menu here to the close, right? So that's what we said in the beginning, that whenever the navigation is actually open, that then here we want to show that other icon that by default is hidden. right? So that's right here. So remember how we did hide that closing icon, right? But now the time has come where we want to actually make it visible. So let's copy this, paste this here. Now here let's display block, and here we can use display because we don't need any animations here for this icon. All right. Now when do we want this to happen? Well, only when the navigation is open. So only when this class here does actually exist in our HTML. So only if that class exists, then this selector here does apply, and it will then show the close icon. So you see that? Now it is here, but of course, then also that one is there. So let's quickly hide that. And that's very simple. We just copy the same code. This one is called probably menu or something. Yeah. So the menu outline, this one should have display none. And again, here we can use it because animations are not necessary. Just to make sure, let's reload. And indeed, that looks just like we want it to be. So I'm cutting this here, or copying and then removing. And you see that it turned now into the menu and everything is gone. But now let's double click again, add a space and add it back on. And then once I hit enter, see how the menu will appear back here and also how this icon here will change. So let's see. And there we go. Beautiful. So that's really amazing, right? So just the power of a simple trick like this of adding and removing this class here. And again, we will, in the next section, use JavaScript to very easily do that. Okay, so we could call it a day here and actually say that we are ready because this is already working quite nice. But actually, I want to just add one more thing here, which is another really, really cool effect, which is to basically have this whole navigation here come sliding in from the right side. And again, I'm sure that you know exactly what that effect looks like from other web pages or other mobile applications. So let's think about how we could do that. Well, we could simply basically move this entire thing here completely out of the page. So basically here to the right side. And then once the navigation becomes visible, then we slide that back in here. So move it basically here with some animation. And the way we can do that is to once again use the transform property. Okay. So let's do that on the default state, which is basically this one here, which is also the one that has the transition. So let's add that maybe here. So transform and then translate. And this one, do we want to translate it horizontally or vertically? Well, of course, in this case here, horizontally. And so that is the x-axis. All right. So basically, we want to move it out of the screen completely by exactly its own width. And so that is 100%, right? So let's see. But now the problem is that we can still see it by scrolling to the right. You see that? So I'm basically scrolling here to the right. Could do that also by clicking here. And so, of course, that is not what we want. So this should be really hidden here on the side and then simply move in. Right? So let's do that. And for that, we need to use yet another new property. So let's come here to general. And this is something that we always do actually when we build a page like this. And so what I mean is that here we will set the overflow, but not just overflow, but overflow X, so horizontally to hidden. And so what this means is that all the elements that overflow the viewport in the x-axis, so horizontally, will simply be hidden. All right. And so with this, well, it should be gone actually. Well, it's not. And so let's also set it on the HTML. So many times we need to set it on both. All right. So not just on body, but exactly on body and on HTML. So let's see that. Reload here. But, well, that is still not really fixed. But the reason for that is that this element here is positioned relatively to the, basically to the viewport. Okay, so remember that we set this here with position absolute, but we didn't then declare the header to being position relative. Remember that? So I said that maybe it wasn't necessary, but actually it is necessary. So one more a little bit strange thing about CSS. So basically this only works if there is nothing absolutely positioned in relation to body. And so that's what right now our main navigation is. So instead we need to set it to its closest parent. So the header here, right? So back here in the top, let's set the position here to relative. And so that should now be fixed. So we should have done that right in the beginning. So as I said, whenever we position something absolutely, we should always put position relative on the parent element in relation to which we want to position this one here. So I skipped that, and so now that created this problem. But now you see, as I try to scroll vertically, it doesn't work. All right. And just wanted to show you something else, which is if we set this here actually to completely overflow, so not just X, then we wouldn't be able to scroll at all. So in no direction. So I'm trying to scroll right now, which you cannot see, but I am trying, and so the page is not moving at all. Of course, that's not what we want, only in this X direction. All right, great. So we moved the whole navigation here to the right using translate. And now let's set it back basically to the initial state once the navigation is open. So we want to transform translate it to 0. Okay. And it's actually very important that we use the transform property to do this animation, because this is way more performant than, for example, doing the same thing using the left property. So we could also have used the left property to create this animation, but then the animation would not be as smooth as it should be. So again, transform is a very, very common property that should be used for transitions, because, well, these kind of animations, they have been optimized by CSS for this property and a couple of others, such as opacity. Okay, so now let's try that. Just making sure here. Let's copy that, remove it, and beautiful. So you saw how that moved out there. Let's put it back. And there it is. Beautifully moved in here. Okay, and with this, we are done, basically. I just want to show you here now finally the third value that we can specify in transition. So I mentioned way back that I was going to tell you more about the transition property. So let's quickly do that now. So remember that the first value here is which property we want to animate, then is the duration, and third is the type of the animation. So if we don't specify anything, then by default, the transition is linear. But we can also specify like a transition curve, which is how we call it. So for example, we can choose ease or ease in or ease in out or this one. So let's try ease out and let's try it over 2 seconds to see the effect a bit better. And so again, I will now remove this here just so we can see it happening. And maybe you saw that the animation was a little bit faster in the beginning. So if I set it back here now, then see how it was a bit fast in the beginning and then it slowed down significantly. So let's do it again by hitting Command or Control Z, right, and then put it back. So that's a trick that I actually just found out for the first time. Right, but now let's try it maybe a bit faster and let's try it with ease in. So reloading actually. And then I'm removing it. And so did you see that? It was a bit slower this time in the beginning, and then in the end it speeded up. And so easing in basically means that it starts slow and then it moves faster in the end. So you saw that? It was again slow in the beginning and then it speeded up. We can also use ease in, out. And the best thing to do here would actually be for you to experiment with this on your own, because that would be the easiest way of seeing this than me just showing these different things here. So this one basically makes it fast in the beginning and in the end and slows down a little bit in the middle. And again, it's not so easy to see that, but I'm showing you this because here I actually want to use ease in and then in fact with half a second. And so this is the effect I was going for. So having it move fast in the beginning and then slowing down at the end. Okay, and with this, we actually finally finished this mobile navigation. So that was a lot of work, maybe some confusing things that we did here as well. And so please make sure to review everything that we did here in order to make sure that you understood what's going on here, so that in the future you can implement a mobile navigation like this on your own. And maybe you will even be able to customize this, so you don't have to create exactly the same kind of navigation for yourself in the future, right? But the overall logic will be the same. For example, things like this additional class here and the way that you hide it in the beginning. So again, make sure to understand this, and then let's move on to our next category of breakpoints and media queries in the next lecture. All right, let's keep working on the smaller version of the OmniFood project. Now, first of all, we need to get rid of this nav_open class in our HTML, because by default, of course, we don't want it. So we want the mobile navigation, of course, to not be visible. Okay, so let's go to our very last breakpoint that we set here. So that's right here. So here everything looks good. And so let's go down maybe to something like 700, maybe, just to see if everything is still okay here. And so here again, everything starts to look really cramped, and it starts to look as if we might need some more space here, so some more width for these 3 columns. And so maybe it's time to now give each of these columns here half of the space and wrap this one into the next column. But let's see. So here everything is good because it has a lot of space now. Here as well. And now here, these pricing tables, they're also starting to get way too thin. And the same probably here. So this is not looking so good anymore. And yeah, the same thing actually here in the footer. So let's see if we can reduce it a bit more even. But yeah, that makes everything even worse. And I think we shouldn't wait until a width like this in order to fix the problems that we just saw. So maybe something like 700 is the right width to start adding a next breakpoint. All right, so let's do just that. So still in our queries.css file. So add media max width. And as always, we need to convert that to m. So dividing by 16, and let's round that to 44. And so 44 is then 704 pixels. So that looks ideal. So 44 m. And then let's just get that standard comment that we have here. So this one was for tablets. And now the next one, let's say, is like for smaller tablets. So below 704 pixels. And here we are, of course, missing that block. And okay. So this is our next media query. And let me quickly just go back here, just to show you what I want to do. So basically everything that is 4 and 3 columns in our grid. So this one, for example, is 4 columns. This one here is 3 columns. And I think that's actually it. But if we had, of course, a bigger page, then we would reuse those classes more. And so we would have more and more grids that had 3 columns and that had 4 columns. But anyway, what I'm saying is that we will now transform these grids that have 3 and 4 columns to just 2 columns, right? And so then we will have basically these two cards here side by side and this list here below that. And then here we will end up with a 2 by 2 grid. So with then 2 columns and 2 rows to accommodate these 4 features, right? So let's see here. And so that's the grid 3 calls and the grid 4 calls. Now this one here we didn't even use. And while I'm not deleting it, just commenting it out. But if we did use it, then we would also now make this here into just a 2-column grid. Okay, and the same for 4. And so let's actually copy all of this here as well. And replace the 4, of course, with 2. And that's it. So just one single line of code, and we have a 2 by 2 grid here all of a sudden. So you see that? That's a lot better like this. It has a lot more space. And the same probably here. Right? So here we are back to some beautiful cards. And even if we scale it down a little bit more, we will still have plenty of space for all of this content here, even at a low width of just 500 and a bit. Right? Now here, this just creates visually a small problem that this would look better if it was centered right here. Right? But, well, that shouldn't be too hard. Let me just inspect this part to show it to you. So I want to show you the entire grid. So this is what our grid looks like. And so all we need to do is to have this column here span all the way to the end. So span these two, and then we can simply align the content that is inside of the cell to the center, right? So let's do that. So let's grab the name from here. So that is called the, well, it's actually not here. Let's see right here in the HTML then. So section meals and meal, and this is the one. So diets. which we didn't yet select in the style.css. But let's now, of course, manipulate that here. And so let's do what I just said previously, which is to span this column all the way to the end of the grid. So that is, remember, grid column. And then we can say that it should start at 1 all the way to the end, which is, remember, -1. Right? So for now, that still looks the same. But now this element here, so you see, now it is actually occupying this entire space. And so now all we need to do is to say justify self. So remember that justify is for the horizontal alignment and self is because we are setting this now on the individual grid item and not on the grid container. And so then we use self and not justify item. So let's set that to center. And there we go. And if we now analyze this, then it looks a lot better because this content here is also centered. And yeah, it makes a lot more sense here like this now. Now, what I'm also noticing is that the spacing here after the H2 is starting to look too big as well. So this one right here. So let's fix that. We already have that somewhere up here. Just so I remember also what value we gave it. So heading secondary, and actually all we did was to change the font size, not the spacing. So I thought we had done that, but apparently not. So the heading secondary has a margin bottom of 9.6. So that's a lot. Let's just try to reduce that to half here. So that's 4.8 RAM in our system. And yeah, that looks quite good. And we could, of course, fix more and more things, like make this one here also smaller, also decrease the spacing here. And we might do that maybe in the next media query. But for now, I will just leave it like this because, well, I'm also not trying to make it 100% perfect here. Because this is just a learning project in the end. So there's no need for it to be 100% perfect. Okay, it just needs to like look usable at least. All right, so here everything is still fine, I would say. Then here, of course, now this looks quite bad. So looks bad here. And also at this point where we start actually the breakpoint. But remember that we need to cover at least like 200 pixels or 150 at least. And so, yeah, this should also look at least quite okay here, which of course it doesn't. And so remember, once again, if we inspect these pricing plans here, that we made each of them only 75% wide, right? So if we remove that, then they would be back to 100%. And so then it does look nice again, right? And so let's basically do that. So pricing plan and set the width back to 100%. So width 100%, and that should do the trick. While here is a typo, right? Pricing plan. Well, that didn't really work. Oh, and actually I already had a typo here before. So this is called pricing plan everywhere in the HTML and in the CSS. So, well, am I gonna fix that? Yeah, maybe I should fix that. So let's call it pricing plan here. So meal, then printing. So that was a typo. The same here. And that's it. Now just let's fix it quickly. Also in the HTML, of course. So after the gallery, so that's here, and here, and here, and here. Okay, great. Now that works. So you see, we reach our breakpoint, and now that is a lot better. Okay, moving on even further, and here we start getting some next problems. Maybe not here yet, but if we take it down even more, then actually this content doesn't even fit at all, and it disappears here in the right side. And now we cannot even scroll there anymore, because we just hit that overflow X in the previous lecture. Remember that? And so now it disappears completely, basically, from our page. So how are we going to fix that? Well, the idea that I got is to basically move these three here, so basically these three navigation columns to the top. So have them first here, and then after that, I will want the logo column here and the contact data column below that. However, that sounds easier at first than it actually is, because I still want these two columns here to have the same width, and I still want these three here to also have the same width. So we cannot simply define a grid with three columns, because that would only work for these three, but not for these two. And let me actually show you that in practice, because that makes it easier to understand the problem. So here in the footer, right now we have this grid with 5 columns. So let's grab this here and change it just to 3 columns for now. All right, so that makes it look like this. But remember how we want these 3 here to actually be the first 3 columns. Or in other words, we want these 3 here to be in the first row, right? So we can do that because we actually gave them a class. Well, we didn't select it here apparently, but there is a class name there, I remember. So let's move down there. Yeah, so here we have the address call. And then here we have the 3 nav calls. Right, so nav call, and nav call. So again, I think we don't have them selected anywhere here. Nope, but let's do that now here. And so what I said previously is that we want them to be in the first row. And so we can, for all of them, say grid row 1, right? And that's actually it. And so now they are right here beautifully sitting at the top, 1 column for each of them, and then these 2 here below them. However, that is again not exactly what we want, because now we want these 2 here to basically occupy the remaining space. However, there is only 1 grid cell left here on the right side. Well, not this one here, but here. So we only have 1 grid cell left, which we cannot really split up for half here and half here, right? That does not work. And so what we need to do instead is to create a grid with 6 columns. And then we have each of these columns here to span across 2 columns, and these 2 here span across 3 columns. And so that will then fix it. So that's a trick that we actually have to do all the time when we build kind of an asymmetric grid like what we're going for here. So let me show you what I mean here. So let's use actually the repeat function. So repeat 6 times 1fr. And so for now, of course, that looks like this. But now here we will say that we want each of them to be in grid column. And then here we can simply say span across 2. All right. And that did already work, even though it doesn't look like it. So now here we have this empty one. So you see that this one here is spanning across these 2 and these 2 and these 2. They simply do not have the same width right now, these columns, because the content down here does not allow for that. So let's fix that very quick. And so what I want is to select the logo call and also the other one. So the address call. So logo call and this one here, we want them to span across 3 columns. So span 3. Let's inspect that. And beautiful. Let's actually turn this view off. We can just reload. And there we go. And so now this is exactly what we were going for. Right? So these two are now basically sharing half the space here, while these other 3 are sharing the space up here. There's just not enough space here right now. So we could go ahead and increase the gap, but that gap is actually coming from somewhere else. So it is coming from the grid itself. And so I do not want to mess with that. So let me simply add some margin to the bottom of these 3. So that's here. 3.2 RAM maybe. And that's a bit better. So before everything looked a bit cramped and we didn't have like enough space around this logo there. Okay, great. So that actually looks really nice even at this lower width. So this is really a great footer. It still looks professionally designed. Right. Now here maybe not so good anymore, but we're also getting ahead of ourselves. All we did here was to work on this breakpoint, and so that works good during all of these width here. So all the way down, for example, to 600. Right? So well done here. We're doing a great job of making this page responsive, and I think we will only need one more breakpoint here to really finish this part. So only a breakpoint for smaller phones are now missing, and so that is exactly what we're going to add in the next and final lecture of this section. Welcome back to our last lecture here and to the last media query that we need to implement in order to now finally make our website also respond to smaller phones. Now, many times for mobile, I like to use a media query at about 600 pixels. However, we just did a media query at about 700 pixels, I think. And by the way, there is something really nice here in this device view that I didn't show you yet, which is that you can click here on this menu and then here show media queries. And so then it adds that view here at the top, which will show us exactly what media queries we have. So this is the ones that we added, and we can then click on them, and it will then move our screen there. So exactly to that position of that media query. So 75M is 1200, then the next one was 944, and then the one that we implemented in the last lecture was this one here. So at 704 pixels, and so that's, I don't think there is a need to implement the next one at 600. So that's just 100 pixels less, and so at this point the design still looks quite nice. Right? So visually everything is okay, so no need to add another one. So let's maybe jump another 100 pixels to 500. Okay. And once again, I'm doing all this here basically so that you can follow my methodology and so that you can learn basically the entire thought process that goes into choosing these breakpoints, because that is something really, really important once you will implement your own designs. But anyway, let's now inspect this here at 500 pixels. And here there is some problem. So these logos are way too big. So this last one is already even moving out of the page. Then here, this image is starting to get really small, and here the content is really big. So the visual balance here in this section is not really nice anymore. And the same here and here. Then here, once again, the card is getting really small. And while here, it still looks okay. here maybe the gallery could be a little bit bigger at this point. And also here, this looks a little bit bad right now. So even our button here already wrapped in 3 lines, and here also in 2 lines, which makes this icon here really small. So that's not good at all. And also here. So here there is not really space for having these 2 columns anymore. And so that's yet another thing that we need to fix. Right. So basically what this means is that at 500 pixels, the design is already too bad. Because if we set a breakpoint at 500, for example, then at 506, let's say, the design would still be like this. So it would still look similar and it would still be bad, right? So let's try to find something in between here, like 550 pixels. So while it is still not ideal, I think it's a bit more acceptable. So here it is still the text on 1 line. Here the images are quite a lot bigger than before. And here at least the logos still fit on the page. So let's set our breakpoint at 550 approximately. And of course, actually outside of this. So add media max width. And let's do 550 divided by 16. And here I'm going to round it actually to just 34. So that will then be 544 pixels. All right. So 34M. And then quickly getting this comment here. So below 544 pixels, which is for phones. Okay. So from now on, what we will do is to have all the grids in just 1 column. So there will no longer be multiple columns because now we don't have enough space for that anymore. So here, what we did in the previous media query was to take the 2 columns and 4 columns and transform them into 2. And so again, now it's time to change that into just 1 column. And the same, of course, for the grid that has 2 columns. All right. So that will already make a big difference. And since we're working on the grid, let's also dramatically decrease the gap. So the vertically gap in this case, because that's going to be the only gap that's left now. So this is actually grid, row gap, and let's say 4.8 rem. And so let's go check it out. So you see that here we already have the new media query, so we can click there. And here, of course, for now, things are similar. And well, this doesn't seem to really have changed. Let me reload. Oh, and actually, I think I didn't even change. Yeah, so of course, this should be 1 FR. Let's actually just write 1 FR then. And yeah, there we go. All right, now the images are huge here, and they're also not in the right order anymore. Because basically what we want is the image to be first, just like here. So first the image, then the text. But since previously we had that Z pattern, this is the order of the elements now in the HTML. So we will need to fix that. But first, let's take a look at all of this. And indeed, it looks now very big, but it will be enough to just reduce this a tiny bit, and immediately it will start looking okay again. All right, so there's a ton of space here now. And so there's a ton of space here now everywhere. But again, let's say we are at like something like 420. And so then suddenly it does look okay, right? Except for this one here, because this grid is not one of those that we just changed. So here we will need to do that manually. But for now, what matters is, that this is now better. So the images also make a lot more sense now here. But let's now change things one by one. And I'm going to start with removing a lot of the spacing here in the hero. So let's say that we make this even smaller. For example, something like the iPhone X will look like this. And so then we have way too much space here on the sides, right? So that space is because way back we added that. I think it was here in this media query. Oh, and I cannot click it because if I want to click it, I need to change back here to responsive. So we added that huge space back here, but now down here it is too much. And so we need to override that again. So let's maybe work at this width here, which is kind of representative of many phones. So many phones are usually around this. So between like 350 and 450. Okay, so again, removing now a lot of the spacing that we have here. So let's actually see what we did back then. So we had the hero. So let's just grab that and then override what we want to change in this situation. So this here, of course, will stay the same. We can also leave the gap, I think. But the padding, let's put it actually back to 3.2, which is what we had before. Okay. Now I'm not sure if that actually changed. But here it is actually quite visible that it did change. So here the space is now way less than it was before. And here it becomes even more visible once we reach this point here. Now there's also way too much vertical space, like here and here. So let's remove that as well. But that I think we didn't touch before. So let's come back here to the top where that section actually is. So here we are. So section hero. Of course, the background color should stay the same. And now I will just basically change both to half. So 2.4 there and 4.8. Maybe that's a little bit too little. So the next one is 6.4. Okay. So that's better as well. The same thing here. So again, judging now on a real phone, that looks quite decent. So now with this, all the content fits here vertically. There is just some problem here with the button. And so let me also fix that as well. So the button right now has a little bit too much space maybe here on the sides. And also, I think it's probably not high enough. So on mobile phones, we really need to make sure that buttons are big enough so that we can actually tap them easily on phones. So let's change that. Right here in the general is where we have our buttons. So let's grab this code here. And so let's actually increase the vertical padding to 2.4, let's say. And then vertically, we need a lot less. So let's say half. So just like this. And now they do, again, fit side by side. And they are also bigger, and which will make them easier to tap. All right. Now just the image here maybe is a bit too small now. So let's increase the width right there. So I think we had changed this already before. But here we need to override that again. And here, of course, hero image. So that will fix that. Yep, that's a bit nicer. And now let's talk about these logos. So of course, they're way too big. So now this one and this one do no longer fit. So let's decrease that. And again, this we already did before, but now we need to make them even smaller at a height of 1.2 rem. So really small, and now they fit just nice, even if the phone would be only like 300 pixels wide. All right, but let's again stay at something like 400. And yeah, let's move on here. And so now we need to switch basically this row with this row right here. Because of course, remember that each of these is basically its own row, right? So we can see that nicely if we turn on the grid, then here we go. So basically what I'm going to do now is to manually select this element here, so this row, and then make it the first row. Then these two here are still correct, and then also I will change this one here with this one. Okay. So back in our HTML, I could now add a new class to these elements that I want to select now. So in particular, this step image box, but instead I will simply use the nth child pseudo class. Okay. So again, this here is one of the rows of this grid, right? And so I will now select this one, and I can then say nth child number 2. And now here it is number 2 and not number 1, because this is actually exactly the second child of this element right here. So this number here does refer to the number of the children of the element and not of the number of the children that has this class here. All right. So indeed, this one here is the first that has this class, right? But it is, in fact, the second child of the container, so of this element right here. And so, therefore, we need to write the number 2 here, even though for the selector, we still need this. Okay, so that's a bit confusing, I know, but that is just how it works. So you just need to keep in mind that this number here is the actual basically order of the child in the container. So it has nothing to do with the class name. Okay, but anyway, here what I want to do is to make this the first row. So basically move this here into the first row. And so that does indeed fix it. Right? And now I just need to select this last one and move it up also 1. So that is the 6th child. And so right now it is in grid row number 6. And if I want to move that up 1, I can just write 5. All right. And there it is. So that was switched, and all the other elements, they are, of course, simply laid out automatically according to their source order. All right. Now, the thing here is that the spacing is now a bit ambiguous. So basically, the spacing between the image and the number 2 here is the same as the spacing between the image and the previous step. And so that doesn't make a lot of sense. So instead, of course, this image should be closer to this number where it belongs to. And the same for this one, and the same for this one. So it's sitting here at the middle, and that doesn't make a lot of sense. Now, we can't change the gap selectively in just some places, right? So the gap property applies everywhere, but we can do a small trick. So we can select all of these boxes here. So basically all of these image boxes. So, well, like this one here, and then move it down just a little bit. So using transform with translate. So step, image box. And now, of course, we want to select all of them. And so transform and then translate. And again, translate is simply the easiest way of moving elements around without affecting the rest of the elements around it. So we want to translate it vertically, and so that's the Y direction. And let's do 24 pixels. Okay, and indeed, that is a lot better. So it's now closer here to the number. And yeah, that looks just perfect. We could even align all of the thing here to the left maybe, but I think that then it would look strange with the circles. So let's just leave it like this. Okay, so moving down here, everything looks good. But then it's also time to make this one here actually with just one column. So this one still has two columns because it is not one of these grids here. So we did this one manually, and therefore that's why this didn't get affected. So let's check out what this one is called. And it is this one here. So the testimonials. And then grid template columns 1FR. And that's it. Right? So that was easy. Once again, thanks to the power of CSS Grid. And let's now also change this one here. So the spacing between these is a bit too much now. And also, let's finally make this a 4x3 gallery. So with just 4 columns. So that is this one here. All right. Let's actually just grab these two, changing it to, as I said, 4 columns, because right now it is actually 6. And then the gap, we can take it down one step to 12 pixel. And yeah, that is a lot better. So now it is still beautiful and we can still appreciate the images here. We could maybe even make it with 3 columns again, but yeah, I think it's good like this as well. Now here, everything actually looks perfect, I would say. So even here, and even when it is even smaller, like this, for example, if we had like an older phone, right? But again, going back to 400, that's still perfect. But of course, here we have this problem that we also need to now make this into 2 columns. So that's very easy, right? So not the meals section, yeah, but here, the CTA section. So actually it's just this one here. And so 1FR right there. Okay, nice. But let's actually make this image here. Oh, well, it disappeared. Why is that? Let's inspect, because that shouldn't be happening. I mean, we do not have a fixed width on this one, on the CTA. Right. And so it should appear. But, well, it doesn't. Yeah, but I think I know why. And the reason is that this div element here does have no content. So this one that has the image has in fact no content at all. And so therefore, it also makes sense that CSS doesn't then give it any height. So before, the only reason why it was visible was because it was side by side with this other element here, which of course has a lot of content. And so then automatically the element that was besides it also had the exact same height. But now that is no longer the case. And so if we want this element here to become visible, we need to now give it manually a height, basically. So that's the CTA image box. And let's try 360 pixels maybe, 36 RAM. All right. And that's maybe a little bit too much. Let's decrease this back. Just reload here quickly. And yeah, I think that's a bit too much. And maybe it would be even nicer if we made this here first. So made it appear before all this. So let's tone it one down to 32. And then let's say grid row 1. All right. And yeah, that looks very nice. Kind of as an introduction to this section here. There's just too much spacing here now, like in this text box still. So let's also quickly reduce that. So that's this. And let's just set that to 3.2 on all 4 sides. And yeah, there we go. Beautiful. And I think that is actually all that I had to change here. So if we take a look at it again on some actual device, let's say the Pixel 2 now, which has 411 pixels apparently, then I would say that we have a very nice web page on this phone. Right? I mean, it might look everything still a little bit too big here, but if you test this on an actual phone in your hand, then you will see that actually it makes sense to be this big. So I did that actually before, and it looked quite nice on my iPhone. So that had this size right here. And yeah, again, everything is just the right size, I think. But of course, these things are also a little bit subjective. So if you want, you can of course also adjust some more things here. And that would then be another great opportunity for you to practice these skills. All right, so if you feel like it, you can do that. But I will call it a day here and call this project finished at this point. So finished at least in terms of HTML and CSS and of responsive web design. Because there is still some things that we will want to do. For example, to actually make this navigation work when we click here. Because right now, well, it is not really working, of course. And also I want to make this navigation sticky so that when we scroll, it stays at the top. And also I will want these buttons here to actually work. So when we click them, that we then have some smooth scrolling animations that goes to the corresponding section. So for all of that, we will need just a little bit of JavaScript. And so I will show you how to create this kind of effect in the next section. But for now, you can take a well-deserved break because you did really, really well in making it all the way to the end of this huge, huge project and writing all this code here by hand in order to create such a great project and such a big real-world project here. So huge congratulations for making it this far. And I'm really proud that you're still with me here. And I hope that you're proud yourself as well. So take care, and I see you soon once you're ready for the next section.